Good morning, everybody. I'm Janet Reardon. I'm the Director of Community Programs at the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, where we do grant making to support American ideas and institutions. I'm here with some rather remarkable people to discuss how the left is working hard to shut you up, lock you up, and shout you down. And every one of the people on this stage has a story to tell that will, if you haven't already heard it, make your hair stand on end. So I'm going to introduce briefly each of my three guests, who are people I know very well and work with very closely. And then I'm going to allow them to tell you their own stories, and we will begin to explore exactly how the intolerance of the left, rather ironically, since they're always preaching tolerance to the rest of us, how the intolerance of the left is becoming weaponized by using the force of civil society through private universities, and even more terrifyingly, through the government. So immediately to my left is Catherine Engelbrecht. She is the president and founder of True the Vote, a citizens group that began as a Tea Party organization and whose purpose is to ensure the integrity of the voter rolls and the accuracy of the vote count. You'd be amazed that that happens to be a controversial idea in some circles. To her left, metaphorically, literally, not metaphorically, is Professor John McAdams. He is the professor of political science at Marquette University, an ostensibly Catholic university in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he is fighting the battle of his career as a tenured professor to keep his job for having written a blog post. And finally, to my right, and I mean that perhaps both literally and figuratively, Rick Essenberg, who is the president and founder of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which is a conservative ACLU. And they have dealt with property, with all kinds of legal issues, ranging from school choice, property rights, and perhaps most terrifyingly, something in Wisconsin called the John Doe law. How many of you have heard about what's been going on in Wisconsin with the Doe? Quite a few of you. So let me just give you just a brief synopsis before I turn this over to my panelists. So 5 years ago actually, then Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker instigated a legal investigation into what he believed might be some embezzlement on the part of someone in the county executive's office. The Wisconsin John Doe law permits, instead of a grand jury, secret investigations in which the targets of those investigations cannot speak to anyone about their investigation, not even a lawyer, at least at first. That first John Doe probe was then used as a tool to attack every conservative, virtually every conservative figure and organization in the state of Wisconsin using secrecy laws. And it culminated 3 years ago with subpoenas and search warrants being issued to 29, I believe, conservative individuals and organizations in pre-dawn paramilitary-style raids. There were dogs, there were guns drawn, people were terrified. One 16-year-old was alone in the house and was not permitted to call his parents, and those houses were raided. To this day, the people whose computers, cell phones, iPads, and papers were taken have not had those items returned, despite the Supreme Court of Wisconsin's declaring this investigation ended. So, as a little, just as a teaser, that's where we're going. So Catherine Engelbrecht, could you please start by telling us a little bit about your experiences as the head of a voter integrity organization?
Sure. So I filed for nonprofit tax-exempt status for True the Vote back in 2010. And I think that that was sort of the dog whistle that was sounded, much to my surprise and amazement, when shortly after that filing of that paperwork, suddenly I guess our organization got put on some very significant radars. And in the months and then years that followed, I found myself the target of either audits or investigations or inquiries that now number, I guess, 23. A whole alphabet soup of federal agencies, from the Department of Justice to the FBI to OSHA to Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and not least among them, of course, the IRS. While those investigations were going on into my life, personal and professionally, I was being, as the head of the organization, barraged with questions from the IRS, ostensibly to determine whether or not we were in compliance with nonprofit standards. But questions, I'll let you decide how relevant these questions were. They wanted to know every Facebook posting I'd ever posted. They wanted to know every tweet I'd ever tweeted. They wanted to know everywhere I'd ever spoken since the inception of the organization, and to which groups and what I said, including copies of transcripts. And they wanted to know where I intended to speak in the 12 calendar months that followed. They wanted to know if I ever intended to run for political office. They wanted to know who was on my board and those political affiliations. It was more like opposition research than it was the IRS doing its duty in determining fiduciary responsibilities. So what I learned from that experience, and I think what the broader message here that you're going to hear underscored time and again, is that we find ourselves in a time and under the eye and in the grip of an administration that counts upon our fear, our collective fear, and from that our silence. And so as long as we remain in that posture, they hold the upper hand. They have the power, and that's the goal. The lesson that you can take, I think, from all of our stories is that when you speak out, people stand up and things change. And that's why I've continued to tell that story from the time it's happened. For a number of years, I didn't say anything because there was a stigma associated with being the target of so many audits, things that were inexplicable. Why would that happen if I weren't in some way on the wrong side of the issue? But as time bore out, and again, I think what you'll hear with all of these stories is when you're targeted, it doesn't mean that there's any merit to it at all. It's just a political game that we find ourselves in a very curious time.
John, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your experiences? First, most particularly, most recently, and then we can get into the larger story a bit later.
Sure. November 2014, a student of mine came to talk to me, and he'd had a very bad experience with an instructor in philosophy. She had been talking about John Rawls' theory of liberty, and in class just mentioned gay marriage and said, well, of course, Rawls' theory would say there should be gay marriage, and yeah, we're not going to talk about that now. If you want to talk about it, you can talk to me after class. Well, this student wanted to oppose gay marriage.
At a Catholic university, right? This is a Catholic university.
Yes, supposedly. So he went up after class and made it clear to the instructor he wanted an opportunity in class to oppose gay marriage. Now, of course, she could have said, well, I didn't think that would be a good use of class time. That would be fair enough. But she didn't say that. He said, well, I have a right to speak. And she said, well, you don't have a right to make racist, sexist, and homophobic comments. And she said, don't you think it would come across as homophobic if you oppose gay marriage in class? And then she asked him, are there any gay students in class? Well, he didn't know, she didn't know, but then she said, well, if you expressed any opposition to gay marriage in class, wouldn't that be offensive to any gay students? Okay. Well, I I blogged about this. He actually had a recording of the interaction with the instructor, which, by the way, is legal in Wisconsin. It's a one-party consent state. So there was no question whatsoever about what she'd said to him. I emailed her asking her side of things. She didn't email back. She emailed some other people in the philosophy department where she was, but she didn't respond to me at all. So I blogged on it. Initially, it got a lot of national attention, not only in particularly Catholic outlets like the Cardinal Newman website. Fox News, Todd Stearns of Fox News picked this up, and so it was getting a lot of national attention. Marquette's first response was kind of defensive. They said, well, here we take a 365-degree view of every issue. But then they began to turn against me for a couple of reasons. After it went national, she started getting some very unkind, some nasty emails. None of them were actually threatening, but some of them were pretty nasty. And she started whining about it. And number two, for the philosophy profession nationally, or at least a lot of philosophers, rallied behind her. There was one philosopher at LSU that made a big crusade of, get McAdams fired. So in early December 2014, on the afternoon, after I had submitted all my grades at noon, by a noon deadline, I was told I was suspended. I was relieved of all duties related to being on the faculty. I was told I was banned from coming on campus.
Essentially, you were treated like a sexual predator. You were treated in the same way that a sexual predator
Well, the way I
would
put it
have
on my blog was I was treated like a terrorist, but either way, it's fine. Anyway, okay, and then they said they were investigating the situation, which is weird because, of course, the facts of what happened were fairly clear. Then in late January, they sent me a letter saying they're going to fire me. Okay, before they can fire me, there has to be, I have a right to a hearing with the Faculty Hearing Committee. By then, Rick and the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty was representing me. Faculty statutes say the hearing has to be within 90 days. They had a bunch of excuses as to why they couldn't do that, and finally in late September 2015, there were 4 days of hearings from the Faculty Hearing Committee. They had a 90-day deadline to get their report in. The deadline was December 23rd, and they missed that deadline, and in fact, they missed it by almost a month. Finally, in the middle of January, they got their report in. Now, since the middle of January, nothing has happened. We don't know what Marquette is going to do. They haven't said they're going to fire me. They haven't said they're going to punish me to some lesser extent. They haven't decided that they're just going to back off. It looks for all the world like they're stalling, knowing it's confidential. Yeah. My lawyer says...
He's going to follow advice of counsel.
Yes, my lawyer says not to
Advice of
discuss
counsel.
it, so, yeah, all right, you do what your lawyer says, okay? At any rate, they seem to be stalling, I think, because they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they back off and decide, well, we're not going to punish McAdams in any way, that's a humiliating retreat. If they punish me in any way, they know, number one, there'll be a firestorm of media attention. As some of you may have noticed, even the mainstream liberal media tend to be tough on campus political correctness, tend to side with whoever wants to say something controversial on a college campus. College administrators don't seem to have noticed that, however. And of course, if they punish me in any way, there'll be a lawsuit. So they're stalling, and so I'm in limbo. I am getting paid, but I don't like being stuck at home. I would much rather be at Marquette teaching and doing scholarly stuff with the resources that come with being at a university.
But so far, they haven't succeeded in shutting you up, as far as I can tell.
Well, no, they haven't. Actually, when I was suspended in, I think it was May last year, I found out that in the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center at Marquette, a mural had been painted on the wall. Now, this is an official Marquette office, right? It's not some faculty member who has a mural on the wall. It's a woman named Asada Shakur, who murdered execution style a New Jersey state trooper in the 1970s, was sentenced to life in prison, was broken out by some of her black militant buddies, fled to Cuba, and is to this day a refugee in Castro's Cuba, and is on the FBI's 10 most wanted terrorist list. I wish I could say that I did a great job of investigative reporting, uncovering this, but actually I found it on their Facebook page. But nobody else had noticed it, so okay. So I blogged about it, and Marquette beat a hasty retreat, obviously being very embarrassed. And I've blogged about several more things since I was suspended.
Thank you, John. So Rick, would you please help the audience to understand what happened in the John Doe?
Right, so the John Doe investigation in Wisconsin is perhaps the most troubling assault on freedom of expression that I've ever seen. I mean, it is, and I've said this again and again, it is one of the worst things that has ever happened in my state. And to understand it, you have to recall back in 2011, our governor, Scott Walker, came to national prominence because he introduced some signature and very bold collective bargaining reforms. He did that to get the state out of a sort of a very, very deep financial hole, and the left went crazy. They occupied the Capitol. It looked like the 1968 Democratic Convention. I felt like I was 12 years old again watching this stuff. And there were recall elections, and all the time that this was going on, the Democratic District Attorney of Milwaukee County had a free-floating, I think it lasted almost 5 years, investigation into everything and anything that had to do with Scott Walker. I have always joked that after having gone through this, Scott Walker has to be the most not guilty man in America. I mean, I am sure that if somebody went through my affairs like that, I would find out that I did things that I never even knew I had done. The part of the John Doe that I want to focus on is what we call John Doe 2. And Jan explained what happened. It was, I think, October of 2013. At least 5 conservative activists had their places of residence raided in the pre-dawn hours. They were told to sit still while armed guards ransacked their homes, took their computers, took their files, took their children's computers. Jan mentioned that in one of the homes, there was a 16-year-old boy. He was home alone. Why was he home alone? I'm not making this up. His parents were off, political activists, raising money for orphans. He was told he couldn't call his parents. But at the same time, about 30 conservative organizations received subpoenas in which they were asked to turn over documents reflecting virtually everything they had done for the last 4 years related to their political activities. At the same time, over 100 activists had their email accounts seized without notice to them. They never knew it happened. They just found out at the end of last year. These targets, these people who had their homes raided, who had subpoenas served on them, were placed under a gag order. They were told that they could tell no one what was happening to them. No one. Oh, you could tell your lawyer. But think about that. Right? This has happened to you. You're a political activist. Maybe you're a political consultant. You now have the state of Wisconsin, the Democratic District Attorney of Milwaukee County is going after you, and you can't say anything. You can't even go to your supporters and your allies and ask for money so that you can defend yourself.
You can't explain to your neighbors why there was a
Absolutely
raid on your
not.
house.
Because imagine this, right? I mean, somebody comes to your home, there's cops all over the place. There's people with windbreakers. There's dogs. There's Krieg lights. Your neighbors are going to wonder why. Some of the children were told that they couldn't even explain why they were late to school that day. So all of this was supposedly done to investigate a violation of the campaign finance laws. And it was presumably approved by a judge. It was a reserve judge, a retired judge who is sort of brought in to look at this thing. And that judge, in approving this unprecedented assault instigated by one side of the political spectrum against the other side of the political spectrum, billed the state for precisely 1 day to review these requests to do this extraordinary thing. In other words, she got out a rubber stamp. Now, I can't get into the sort of the intricacies of campaign finance law, because basically when people tell me, can you understand, can I learn and understand campaign finance law? The answer is usually no, because even if you understand it, you won't understand it because it's so vague and broad that it's very difficult to know what you can do and what you can't do, and that was true here in Wisconsin. These activists were engaged in independent, what is called in the law, independent issue advocacy. That is, they were running ads that might have mentioned a candidate, but they were basically about issues. The United States Supreme Court has made clear that independent issue advocacy is absolutely protected by the First Amendment. The government cannot restrict it. It cannot limit how much you can give in order to facilitate it. It cannot limit how much can be spent in order to make it happen. But the prosecutors had a theory. They said, oh, this might be illegal because we think that these activists might have coordinated with Scott Walker's campaign. And if they coordinated with Scott Walker's campaign, then that makes everything they spent on these independent ads a contribution to the Walker campaign. Because what they spent would certainly exceed the limit that an individual can donate to a candidate under Wisconsin law. Recharacterizing their expenditures as contributions would make them instant felons. Now, when I heard about this, I talked to a colleague here in DC who specializes in campaign freedom, and I said to him, I don't think the prosecutors understand this concept of coordination very well. And he said, well, no one does. In order for this theory to work, you have to have, state law has to at least, it's not clear that it can actually ever be applied to issue advocacy, but if it can be applied to issue advocacy, the court has made clear that state law has to clearly say so. It has to clearly define what constitutes coordination, because of course activists and candidates are communicating with each other all the time. And it has to specify when this thing called coordination can happen. And the thing that was really odd about this is that these ads that these activists run were being run during elections in which Scott Walker wasn't on the ballot. When I heard about this, when I heard about that was the theory, I said, well, that can't possibly be the case. And then I found out that it was. When we asked people asked the prosecutors, well, how can you possibly advance this theory, Scott? How can this be a contribution to Scott Walker? Scott Walker wasn't running for anything at the time. Well, he wanted those candidates to win. He wanted those candidates to win. That was the answer. Well, this went on for a couple of years, and all sorts of litigation, millions of dollars being spent, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court finally halted the whole thing. Right? The prosecutors are going to try to take the case up to the United States Supreme Court. They don't have a prayer. They won't win. But here's the thing. I've had people sit in my office and tell me, I'd like to get together with some people, raise some money, speak on some issues, but I don't want to hear pounding on my door at 5 o'clock in the morning.
So actually, the chilling effect of these kinds of shutdowns and lockdowns is, I think, the most pernicious because it's something you can't count. You can't tell how many people. Rick has had conversations. I'm sure some of you have had conversations with people who say, your situation has frightened me, I don't want to speak. But there's one thing that has particularly puzzled me since Catherine's experience with the Tea Party movement and the IRS. Have you all noticed, has anyone thought to ask, what happened to the Tea Party? Where did all those little Tea Party groups go in every county and every state? All of those well-intentioned people, American citizens, who believed that the Constitution was something that was theirs and enumerated their specific natural rights. Catherine, can you talk a little bit about what happened to you and what effect do you think this had on the Tea Party movement?
Sure. So the impact it had on me, I guess, personally, was a number of years sort of wandering in the wilderness thinking, what is really happening here? I mean, sometimes you wake up in the morning...
Excuse me, one moment. For those of you who don't do fundraising, I want to be clear that a designation from the IRS for a 501c3 gives you permission to raise money tax-free. It's not income, it's contributions. So that designation, that power that the IRS has to determine whether you're a nonprofit is what determines whether or not you have the money to operate. So I'm sorry, Catherine.
No, absolutely, it's an important point because it really does. It limits you. You can't apply for many foundation grants. There's just a sort of a stamp of legitimacy once you get that nonprofit status. And it's worth noting that typically it takes an organization 4 to 6 months-ish to go ahead and get that designation and move on down the road. We fought to get a designation for over 3 years and didn't get one until we, in fact, sued the IRS, which is another full topic for another panel discussion, but we will be in the next few months back in federal court, the Court of Appeals now, with our suit against the IRS. So, yeah, it's continued on.
And this was the heart of the case with Lois Lerner, incidentally. These targeted refusals of 501c designation to groups that had the word Tea Party in their titles.
So you asked about what happened to some of the other groups. We decided that it would be important to find out if, in fact, there were commonalities between the kinds of questions that we were being asked as an organization. So I'll put my personal story to the side for a second and just say, organizationally speaking, what kind of questions was True the Vote being asked in their applications? And if you've not filed a nonprofit application in the past, I'll kind of give you a primer on it very quickly. You fill out a very simple application, you turn it in. It's not uncommon for the IRS to come back and ask a few clarifying questions, and then generally, that's it. They give you an up or a down. Either you are qualified as a nonprofit or you are not. And that's an important point to remember because what the IRS did for over 3 years was strung these little groups out like dangling a carrot. And it wasn't just 5 or 6 questions that they would come back and ask. It was round upon round of hundreds of questions. And every time, for years, when these little groups were asked, it was sort of the proverbial when the IRS said jump, we said, how high? And we answered what we could. Because we really believe, well, certainly if we just clear up this last little bit, we'll get those nonprofit statuses and we'll be able to do the things that we want to do in our communities. Well, long and the short of it is, if you recall, back in, I guess, 2013, USA Today published a list that became public called the BOLO list, the Be on the Lookout list. Does anybody here remember the reference to the BOLO list? Okay, well, that made the papers. And there were 200 some odd groups that had been targeted for all kinds of reasons. Either they had the word patriot in their name or somewhere in their documentation they indicated that they were pro-liberty. There were all kinds of triggers that got them pulled. So we thought as an organization that after our lawsuit it would be interesting and worthwhile to reach out to these groups and ask if we could look at their IRS questions that they received. Maybe there were some patterns that could be recognized. Maybe the analysts were the same. Maybe the time periods were the same. Maybe the types of questions were the same. We already knew, and this is just beyond the pale, we already knew that groups across the country were being asked on their IRS applications about their affiliations with True the Vote and what they knew about True the Vote. So we already knew that was happening. We wondered how much more. We reached out to these groups, 200 some odd groups, and what we found, Jan, was that 80+% of the groups no longer exist. So you wonder what happened. What happened to the IRS? What happened to the Tea Party movement? What effect did the IRS targeting really have? It had its effect that it sought from the outset. It silenced those groups that were in existence, and it dissuaded those who might want to take a stand. They sought to silence, and they did.
And it's important to point out that, it's one thing to have a political back and forth, but what's terribly frightening about this is that an agency of the federal government is now being used to shut down its opposition. And so not only, ultimately after 3 years, her group did receive a 501c3. But these other little groups, without the power of legal support, which Catherine was lucky enough to have, couldn't fight. And not only did they go away, but a lot of Catherine's donors went away and have still gone away because the IRS demanded the release of all the names who donated to her. And the immediate chilling effect on those people and those potential donors was, what are they going to do to me? That's the effect of what's happening right now to people we don't even see here. John, talk a little bit, please, about what you perceive to be the message, the chilling effect that's happening, not perhaps to you, because you're one of a kind, but what is the effect, do you believe, on campus of the kind of witch hunt that's being conducted toward you?
Well, I know people are scared. I know of at least a couple of situations right now on the Marquette campus I'd like to blog about, but the source, the person who was subjected to, for example, the whole doctrine of harassment is used to shut people up. A few years ago, I was charged with sexual harassment because I told a class, an entire class, that feminists, researchers exaggerate the prevalence of date rape. The person who filed the complaint had no one-on-one interaction with me whatsoever. I just told the whole class that, and I was charged with sexual harassment, and I had to explain what I'd said, blah, blah. Well, of course, I was let off the hook because I had every right to say that, but again, that's a chilling effect. There's a guy in one department at Marquette who apparently was faced with the same situation, but he's quit responding to my emails. Why? I think he knows that the Marquette administration, if I blogged about it, I would obviously conceal his name, but the administration would know who it was. So I can't blog about it because he won't give me the details. There was another student who was told by a philosophy professor that opposition to abortion is equivalent to supporting slavery. Okay? I didn't get to that immediately because I was, under attack by Marquette. But when I got back to her, she basically said, no, this has been settled. I don't want to talk about it. So there is a huge chilling effect of people who believe that they'll get in trouble if they go public with how they've been mistreated, or indeed if they simply go public with politically incorrect opinions.
Well, and I need hardly remind everyone about what happened at Yale this past fall when a member of the Yale faculty mentioned that she thought it was perfectly okay for college students to pick their Halloween costumes, and the resulting explosion of campus protests for her microaggressions and her intolerance was, I suppose, reached its pinnacle with a screaming match of the most incredible vulgarity of a very privileged Yale student against a Yale professor. And ultimately, the Yale staff member who wrote the email saying, gosh, maybe we should pick our own Halloween costumes, was fired, or actually voluntarily left because the environment at the university was so terrifying. She was afraid. So earlier, Rick, you mentioned the vagueness of the law. And I think if you look at each of these cases, one of the things that they have in common, aside from the fact that that the left is shutting people down, one of the things that they all have in common is this sort of nebulous quality of the charges the nebulous quality of the reasons being given for the investigations, for the stalling, for the placing people in limbo so that they can't actually progress. Rick, talk to us a little bit about vagueness in the law.
There's always a reason, right? People always have a reason to restrict speech, but our founders knew better, right? They put in our Constitution, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. No, none, never, not at all. Because there, you know, when we represented in John's case, well, the university said, well, you know, you could have done this a little bit better. You could have written the blog post in a way that was more to our liking. In the campaign finance area, people say, well, you know, we need to restrict money in politics. Money is not speech, which I think is, quite frankly, the most ridiculous thing that I have ever heard in my life. The First Amendment does not simply protect your ability to yell at the cars while they go past you on the road, right? You cannot speak unless you get together with other people and you bring resources to bear. If the left doesn't believe this, let me put it another way. What if we passed a law that said that it was illegal to pay a doctor to perform an abortion? And when the left come and said, well, you're infringing our constitutional right to choose to have an abortion, and we responded, well, paying a doctor isn't having an abortion, right? They would understand that protecting a constitutional right is protecting you need to protect your ability to exercise that right. And you can't have robust freedom of expression when people who want to speak have to have in the back of their mind the notion that there are these vague and broad restrictions and requirements that will subject what they have said and what they have done to an after-the-fact examination by someone who may actually be politically opposed to them. All of these things, the ability of the IRS to mess around in Catherine's business, the assertion of the university that they are able to restrict speech in order to create a safe space for students or limit microaggressions, or the attempt on the part of the government to regulate and referee who can say what when. All of these are tools for abuse that are given to the government. And we know that if you give the government the power to abuse something, the government will abuse it. And so I think we have to understand that when it comes to the First Amendment, when it comes to freedom of expression, we have to be absolutists. We don't get into partisan politics at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, but we have a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination who says he wants to open up the libel law so that powerful politicians like him can sue and shut up people who criticize them. Absolutely not. That's antithetical to everything that we should stand for. It's antithetical to everything that I stand for. And we shouldn't retaliate in kind because they do these things to us, but we're better than them.
So one of the things that occurs to me when we're talking about the snowflake rebellions, as my husband Charles Sykes likes to call it, on college campuses, these frail little beings who are hurt and who need to go into safe spaces with puppy dogs if someone says something that offends them. I'm not making that up. Seriously, you can't make that up. I wonder, John, if there's some connection between the curious lack of civics education, the curious lack of understanding of the First Amendment on the most elementary level in our school systems. What do you think about that?
Probably so. Although, you know, there could be different forms of civic education. I think there are probably some politically correct teachers who think it's civic education when they tell people that, you know, hate speech ought to be banned.
Right, or that the United States is an oppressive force.
I think it's really a sort of a broader cultural issue, and increasingly the culture of the left becomes intolerant. A lot of people who rallied behind me are what I call old-style liberals, right? They grew up believing in free speech. They still believe in free speech. But they're a declining minority in academia, particularly in the humanities disciplines and in the social sciences, with economics and partially political science being exceptions in the social sciences. They've been taken over by notions of political correctness, of people who just flatly think that speech they label racist, sexist, and homophobic, which of course is pretty much anything they disagree with, needs to be silenced. So I think it's a broader cultural thing. I don't think requiring a civics class from everyone necessarily would help.
Catherine, you were not just targeted by the IRS. Tell the audience, if you would, a few more details about how other government agencies, in concert with the IRS, we think. It's kind of the coincidence seems kind of large. Could you talk a little bit about what else happened to you?
Sure. So when I founded True the Vote, and I founded another organization called King Street Patriots at the same time, when I founded those two organizations, I was still the president of a company called Engelbrecht Manufacturing. We made oil field parts for energy companies. We'd been in business for 16 years. We'd never had any audits. There had never been any issue with any government entity. Personally, we'd never been audited. So no history, no track record of a problem. File the nonprofit paperwork. Don't hear anything from the IRS for months and months and months. But the FBI starts showing up at True the Vote and King Street gatherings. Later on, when we filed Freedom of Information Act requests to get our own files back and see what was going on behind the scenes, you'll love this. It turns out that the FBI group that came out and paid us repeated visits was from the Domestic Terrorism Unit. And in their notes, they characterized their visits to us, I kid you not, as community outreach. Aw, thanks, guys. That's awesome. You could have just sent a fruit basket. That'd have been cool, too. But, you know, the repeated visits, they wanted to know specifically about people who were attending the meetings. Now, they were open to the public. We don't have a membership, per se. So, you know, we're an open book. But do you think it has a chilling effect when people who are just exploring sort of their voice in the liberty movement for the first time arrive at a gathering where people with the sort of curly wire going around the back of their ear are standing at the door? Yeah, that kind of freaks people out. Shortly thereafter, now that was getting into the first part of 2011. Then the IRS audits started personally. They were not normal audits. They were, we have a small family farm. They wanted to go out to the farm, which was out of town. They wanted to look at the cattle and the fence line and count the bales of hay. Again, I kid you not. After that, and the moral to that story is we ended up getting a refund, so that wasn't all bad. But after that, they started in on the company. Then in the midst of that, on two separate occasions, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms showed up. We had filed, if you are in oil and gas energy kind of sector, you might remember when the Obama administration passed a moratorium on all offshore drilling. And when that occurred in 2010, it was devastating in our industry. And so we thought, if we wanted to ever diversify, maybe we could make gun parts. And you have to get a license to do that. Now, we never made one, still haven't made one. And the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms knows that full well because you have to file quarterly reports that state as much. Nonetheless, they showed up and wanted to do an audit. Well, that's within their rights to do. They wanted us to open our gun safes, which we did. They wanted us to take out all the guns. They wrote down all the serial numbers. And it happened not once, but twice. OSHA showed up when I was actually, neither I nor my husband at the time were there present, the two owners of the company. OSHA showed up, demanded to talk to the employees. No accident, no, we were a small little machine shop, no reason for them to show up. But at the end of that interview process, we ended up with roughly $27,000 in fines. Now, the curious thing about all of this is, what is the statistical probability? Oh, and I failed to mention that the Texas arm of the EPA also showed up after an anonymous complaint was called in about our organization. So, what are the statistical probabilities that 5 different branches of the federal government would show up in the span of a year after no provocation prior? There's no record that would be anywhere close to what one might expect. But now they're all sort of swarming about. There's absolute collusion. You know, you think about sort of the criminal dramas, right, where criminal justice dramas, where you walk in, where you see the scene where they have a wall with everybody's pictures on it and like pieces of yarn that connect everybody. I don't know I mean, sometimes I promise you that I can feel the blades of the black helicopter over my shoulder. But you got to wonder. And Jan, you've used the term weaponization. That's the left's game. They derive power from agitation, and they fully intend to weaponize any aspect of their reach that they possibly can to get what they want, to get their agenda furthered. And they'll stop at nothing until we stand up and say no more.
So, Rick, are they getting away with it? Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, yes and no. So, you know, these two are very courageous, but you shouldn't have to be a hero to participate in the political process.
Amen.
And they're not getting away with it because so far the United States Supreme Court has stood up for freedom of expression. But they have stood up for freedom of expression by 1 vote, right? It's 5-4. If the composition of this court ever changes, then the law governing freedom of expression would probably change radically. Right now, I think that the courts have been a stalwart. They have been our last line of defense. Our last line of defense now is imperiled. That's one of the reasons that this presidential campaign matters so much.
It's interesting, though. A little over a year ago, I was privileged to hear Antonin Scalia, I should say the late sainted Antonin Scalia, speak, in which he said that we must not depend upon the courts for our salvation. And the fact of the matter is, what Rick just said is absolutely true, that the people, and I include actually Rick in this as well, the people on the stage are heroes, and you should not have to be one in order to participate. We have about 12 minutes. Would the audience like to ask some questions? Okay, the first hand I saw was over here. And I would ask everyone, please, could you ask questions, not make statements? Thank you.
Okay, so real quick, thank you. I have a Tea Party. We have changed what we do because of what happened to you. But my question is for this man from Milwaukee.
I'm getting a sign for your office door that says that, Rick.
There is a speaker, a tall guy with a cowboy hat.
David Clark.
And how is this possible to have David Clark from Milwaukee and a prosecutor from Milwaukee? I mean, who went out and served these subpoenas? How do you rectify those two? Because they're complete opposites.
Actually, I don't think that any of the warrants were served in Milwaukee County. These people actually didn't live in Milwaukee County. But even if they had, it probably would have been the Milwaukee Police Department. I really like David Clark. I spoke at his last investiture, but he didn't have any authority. He didn't have any power to do anything about this.
Next question. Gentleman in the orange shirt.
So, I'm the executive director of the Tax Revolution Institute. We're right now fighting an IRS rule that would redefine free speech as political activity, some of the same things you were talking about there. But we want to inspire people to fight back against the IRS and to fight back against tax enforcement abuse. So even though the title of this speech is shutting you up and shutting you down, what would you say to other people who are in a similar position guys went through, or who might find themselves in that position, what would you say to inspire them to fight back against government abuse, to fight back against the IRS?
What I tell people is, and it's sort of, there's no gilding the lily on this, you've got to know how deep your well is. How much are you willing to give to this? How truly do you believe in freedom of speech? What are you willing to sacrifice if that's threatened?
And this is the chilling effect, by
That's right.
definition.
That's right. And you know, everybody has their different threshold, right? And for me, what price freedom? I mean, why wouldn't I be willing to go, as they say in The Godfather, go to the mattresses? Why wouldn't I? Because what else is there, you know? And I can't stress it enough, my friends. This is what they count on, is us questioning what should we do. What we should do is stand up and recognize that there's strength in numbers, that we are right. We are on the right side of this issue. Know why you believe what you believe, and nobody on this ticket, nobody that's in this sort of primary, you know, stew that we see right now, none of them are a savior. You've got to know why you believe what you believe and be willing to stand, and then let the chips fall where they may. That's the only, until we get right with ourselves, that's the only way that this changes.
Lady in the front row.
I have a question for the professor, but before I do that, I've been with Catherine from the beginning in our groups, and she has the most integrity and the most courage of any person I have ever met.
I couldn't agree more.
I am a graduate student at Rice University in Houston. And it's been a long time since I was in school, but my question is, the professors keep trying to shut me up. I almost got kicked out of the program in my first class because I said that I didn't know whether Islam and democracy could coexist, but that this one essay didn't prove it, and she tried to get me kicked out of the program. 2 weeks ago, he was in a class on beliefs. The professor gave us this thing on climate change that he said is that the people that deny climate change are the same people that believe aliens have come down and landed in that. And I pointed out that when you look at these variables, he had said that 20% was trivial, and this other relationship was 21%.
So you're asking for some support here, right?
What do I do? I mean, because he's screaming at me, and what does someone do?
Number one, you can publicize that, which does indeed embarrass the people who do it, okay? Now, you might get some blowback. If you do that, you might get some blowback. But yes, there is, it has a deterrent effect if you will publicize that. Now, it's also the case that sometimes you get sort of wacky professors, and if you take it up with a department chair, or you take it up with the dean, you'll get a different verdict. And at the extreme, look for lawyers, look for groups like the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, who will be on your side. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Education is very good, okay? I don't think there's any way to deal with that unless you're willing to actually fight.
And again, so they propose a chilling effect on you, then it's time to turn the tables. You raise the opportunity cost.
I debated between two different things, and I did something totally unrelated to politics because I was afraid of what was going to happen.
Right.
But on
Next.
the other hand, he gives you a grade, and that's...
Understood.
If you fight, you will find, number one, you can embarrass the people who've done something oppressive to you, and number two, you will have allies. You know, that's the best I can say. I can't say you won't make enemies. I've made plenty of them among politically correct academics. I'm simply saying you will have allies if you fight. You can embarrass the people who have who've done something oppressive.
Gentleman in the front row.
Is there a candidate running for president right now who has the best stand on these issues that you're talking about?
To whom are you addressing your question? Rick, do you want to make a public stand? Because I know how shy you are about these things.
The views that I'm about to express are my own and not those of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which neither endorses or opposes candidates for office. I think that we have...
That's the disclaimer, yes.
I think that on the Republican side, on these issues, we have 2 and possibly 3 candidates who are just fine. We have 1 who is just horrible. You figure, I think you know who I'm talking about.
Rick has published what he believes in an outlet called Right Wisconsin. So rightwisconsin.com is worth looking at, even if you come from Montana or California or Maine or something.
Its editor is here in the audience, incidentally. So, gentleman in the back row.
I speak to you as a former resident of the People's Republic of Madison.
My sympathy.
It seems to me, I'm outraged by all of this. Having been away from the state, I didn't realize how far it had gone. And so my question to you is, it seems to me that the people who cynically abuse the criminal process for political purposes are themselves subject to prosecution. I'm wondering if that's any kind of possibility.
So in this whole John Doe saga, it's sort of interesting what happened. There was one person who was involved, a gentleman named Eric O'Keefe, who decided that he was going to, in a very limited and controlled way, defy this gag order. I mean, he basically, he challenged them to prosecute him. He spoke about what was going on.
And may I interject for a moment? The reason he was able to do that is that he's a very wealthy man and very brave, but very wealthy man.
He'd be the first to acknowledge it. And in fact, I've heard him say that. So, and they filed a number of civil lawsuits against these prosecutors. The one that they filed was ultimately not successful. There are some other sort of spin-offs that are still continuing. It's extremely difficult to bring such an action because the law is heavily stacked in, generally speaking, and you know, Jan said that, you know, my group is like a conservative ACLU. Sometimes I say in groups like this that, you know, people say, well, what do you do? We sue liberals, and I'll be, you know, sending a notepad asking for names and addresses at the end of this. But we sue the government a lot, but the government makes the rules, and it's hard to successfully sue the government. But he's tried, and so far not successful, but it's not over yet.
I wasn't speaking of civil process.
No, we understand.
But the same thing will apply.
Young lady in the white, please.
It's a good question. How was it that these agents
We have 1 minute.
of the agencies came out? Within each of these agencies and the way that they operate, they have, I mean, for the fact that we had a license to manufacture gun parts. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms does have the authority to come into your place of business and do an audit. And that's the case with all of these agencies. They had the right to do what they did, and I don't take exception to that. They were all very professional. The question I have is, who pointed them in our direction? Those folks were just following orders. That was coming from Pennsylvania Avenue. No doubt about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. I'm sure that our panelists would be happy if you have any further questions to chat with you outside, because there's another panel coming in here. So we'll meet with you outside the room.